By default, all pods can communicate with one another. However, what if access to certain pods must be restricted? The solution is to implement a network policy. A network policy is a set of firewall rules applied at the pod level that restrict access to other pods and services inside the cluster. For example, in a multi-layered application, network policies can be used to restrict access at each stack level. A web layer could only be accessed from a certain service, and an application layer beneath this could only be accessed from the web layer. This effectively promotes defense in depth. So why should you consider using network policies? Imagine an attacker compromised one of your pods by exploiting a security vulnerability in it. Just by gaining access, an attacker would have the power to probe outwards from the compromised pod to all other pods in your cluster. And they might even find other vulnerabilities. As a result, it would be wise to limit the attack surface of your cluster. While network policies can be complex to manage, GKE Data Plane v2 simplifies the process with built-in policy enforcement, eliminating extra overhead. Autopilot clusters in GKE come with Data Plane v2 enabled by default, simplifying network policy management. For standard clusters, you can manually enable Data Plane v2 and take advantage of its streamlined network policies, provided your cluster meets the minimum requirements. GKE Data Plane v2 leverages eBPF, a powerful technology that operates within the Linux kernel. As packets arrive at a GKE node, GKE Data Plane v2 decides how to route and process the packets. Crucially, Data Plane v2 taps into Kubernetes-specific metadata embedded in these packets. This enables efficient packet processing and provides detailed, annotated logs for comprehensive network visibility. After you enable network policy enforcement for your cluster, you need to define the actual network policy. Enabling network policy enforcement consumes additional resources and nodes. This means you might need to increase your cluster size to keep your scheduled workloads running. Network policies are written in YAML files and have the kind network policy. The pod selector lets you select a set of pods based on labels. If pod selector isn't provided or is empty, the networking policy will be applied to all pods in the namespace. Policy types indicates whether ingress, egress, or both traffic restrictions will be applied. If policy types is left empty, a default ingress policy will apply automatically, and an egress policy won't be specified. In the ingress section of the policy, there are two main sections, from and ports. The from section can be from three sources: IP block, namespace selector, or pod selector. The ports section states what ports ingress will be accepted from. The combination of these two elements defines where traffic is allowed to enter the network. In the egress section of the policy, there are two main sections, to and ports. In the example, traffic destined for network 10.0.0.0/24 on TPC port 5978 will be permitted to egress from the demo app's pods. Remember, applying network policies does nothing if you haven't enabled network policy on your cluster. You can use the gcloud container clusters update command to disable a network policy. In the Google Cloud Console, disabling a network policy is a two-step process. You first disable the network policy for nodes, and then you disable the network policy for the control plane. If no network policies exist, all ingress and egress traffic will be allowed between the pods in the namespace regardless of whether network policy enforcement is enabled or disabled. There are default policies that can be invoked if no other rules match. The default deny policy for ingress or default deny policy for egress block all incoming or outgoing traffic respectively. An allow all policy exists for both ingress and egress. This allows all traffic in that direction. Please note the difference in wording between this and the default deny keyword. For the default policies, a policy type ingress or policy type egress is required depending on the direction of the traffic.